Hi, thanks so much for joining me for another new series of interviews with experts in the field of executive functioning. Today I'm going to be speaking to Professor Peter Hill. He is an eminent child and adolescent psychiatrist based here in London. And we're going to be talking about girls and ADHD and how during this difficult time they'll be coping differently to the challenges that we face. We're also going to be talking about how ADHD and executive functioning disorder can be kind of interchangeable and the difference and similarities between them. And also we're going to be thinking about how parents can really help young people at this time, especially girls with ADHD. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this 10 to 15 minute interview with one of the UK's most well-known psychiatrists. Peter, for joining me today and giving up your free time to speak to me about the current crisis and what's going on inside the brains of some of the young people we work with. So we've been talking a lot recently about ADHD and about the difference between girls and boys with ADHD. So tell me, firstly, how do girls with ADHD present differently from boys?
Well, girls can have ADHD, not quite as many girls as boys. It's not as frequently, it's not as common as it is in boys. So they can have ADHD, but it often looks different. You use the same standards, the same criteria to make a diagnosis, but you notice that the girls themselves are much quieter. They're not noisy, boisterous, hyperactive. They tend to be more inattentive, sometimes a little impulsive. The word for that often is chatty. So they are a little bit fidgety, a little bit chatty, but generally speaking, they're not as overwhelmingly overactive or indeed angry or hostile as boys can be, partly because of that's the way that ADHD is in girls, and partly because they're more likely to have organizational problems alongside their ADHD, whereas boys tend to have behavioral problems alongside their ADHD. Don't have to, but that's the general rule. So the girls are quieter and therefore get overlooked. They're not the squeaking wheels that get oiled. They are overlooked. They tend to drift towards the back of the class if it's a classroom. They can be very quiet. They can, of course, be very chatty, but people don't think of them as having ADHD, so they get missed. And that means that they come to services and attention of the education system as well later. So typically the girls I see with ADHD are most likely to be early teenagers.
Brilliant. So they're in their early teens and they tend to be quite chatty. But how does it affect their learning and their day-to-day life? What do you see?
Well, I think they've usually got two problems going on. They've got the characteristic inattention. Inattention is quite a complex idea. It's both not being able to focus on your work, but it's also about not seeing things through. And we get into the language of cognitive executive function difficulties, which are indeed some of the criteria one uses to diagnose ADHD. There's such an overlap between cognitive executive problems and ADHD in girls. It becomes very hard to find a dividing line between them. So they are going to be inattentive, they are going to be disorganized because of their ADHD and the associated cognitive executive problems. And that causes them problems on a day-to-day basis. The ultimate result of that is they achieve less, they think poorly of themselves, their self-esteem suffers, and generally speaking, they expose themselves to the language of exasperation expressed by teachers and parents. They're constantly being asked, why? Why didn't you do this? Why aren't you ready now? What is holding you up? Because their difficulty getting themselves organized, it exasperates and tests the patience of those who are trying to look after them and support them or teach them.
Yes, absolutely. I see that all the time with the girls that we work with, this kind of feeling of like low self-confidence, and they take on board this kind of internal voice that they're not trying hard enough, or everyone else can do it, why can't you? And that can be really hard for them to deal with. Thank you so much. So you talked just then about executive functions, and as you know, as we well know, Connections' mind is very interested in executive functions. That's what we focus on. But the academic researcher Russell Barkley talks about ADHD being an executive function disorder. Can you tell us a bit more about what that means, or what he means by that? And how differences in executive functions might manifest differently in girls and boys?
Well, Russell is an enormously persuasive speaker and a hugely experienced psychologist. And he persuaded me 20 years ago that indeed this is the right way of thinking about it, that one could see ADHD in terms of weak cognitive executive function. I thought he was right. The difficulty was that the folk I know who do tests and experiments and assessments of cognitive executive function couldn't find the match that he claimed, and I believe. So there is a huge overlap, both in the definition of ADHD and in the facts of what one sees in real life. But trying to demonstrate that scientifically has been remarkably difficult and elusive. So I think he's right. I mean, characteristically, the girls I see who present with ADHD, right, they've got ADHD, but they also have typical cognitive executive difficulties. They are weak on self-organization. They don't know how to pack a school bag systematically. They just chuck everything in. They don't sort things. They don't organize things. They can't do things quickly. They take ages to get things done. They procrastinate and fiddle and have wonderful revision notes in the time when we needed revision notes with well-decorated colors and multiple underlining, but the content doesn't actually get done because they're not very good at planning and deciding what's a priority, what has to be done. So they can procrastinate, they put off getting started. They take a long time to settle to something. When they do, it's often not the beginning of an assignment, it's the middle. They're not great at setting themselves the goals that they need. So everybody tends to try and set those for them. What you need to do is write an introduction. No, I don't want to do that. I'm going to do the middle bit because it's more interesting. They don't find it easy to have a systematic approach to problem solving. So that everything gets rather chaotic. And then they lose where they are. They don't monitor, they don't observe how far they've got with the task that's got to be accomplished. So they are disorganized. And when they're required to think of alternative ways of getting around things, they find that hard to generate alternative solutions. So these are the sorts of problems that the people I see are up against all the time. And it's hard going for them, it's hard going for their parents, and it's hard going for their teachers. And ultimately, it's hard going for them because the stuff doesn't get done in the way that everyone else thinks they should, because they're usually bright enough, but they can't get that level of self-organization into place.
Absolutely. So interesting saying there that they're often bright enough. Often we find that these children, they really are intelligent, they can get the work done, and often they've got through school because they have been really good, especially very good verbally, and so teachers haven't really realized there's been a challenge for them until maybe A levels, when a bit more independent learning is needed. And then some of them don't come to us until they're at university, when independent learning is the key to the game. That's what you've got to do. So it's so interesting about how that kind of manifests with girls. Thank you. So we're thinking about the current time that we're in now, in the midst of the coronavirus crisis. In your opinion, what particular challenges will girls with ADHD be facing during this difficult time?
Not seeing as much as they would like of their friends. It seems to me to be really rather important. Of course, they can chat with them, but the parents are probably trying to restrict the amount of phone time or tablet time they have, because there's other stuff that might need to be done. And as this term begins to start up, as we're speaking now in mid-April, I think that's going to be a bit of an issue. They need contact with their friends. It's one of the ways in which girls regulate their emotional self-control, which is always a bit dodgy in ADHD. So that, I think, seems to me quite an important one. How to negotiate social contact in a way that your family can tolerate, your friends can tolerate, and that actually works for you. That's one thing that I'm noticing now. The other thing I don't think I can say that I've noticed, but I can see it coming, is endless opportunities for procrastination. And if you've got a weak cognitive executive function, you're going to procrastinate. You're not going to use your time judgment. You're not going to set priorities. You're not going to self-monitor on progress. You're going to put it off and put it off and put it off. And I think that's going to be tough. Schools tend to manage that for you. They scaffold your learning because they've got a curriculum in their mind, or indeed a curriculum that they've been told to follow, that provides educational progress by its own nature. I think it's going to be tougher at home.
Absolutely, absolutely. Schools are so good at getting the task initiation piece out of the way, aren't they, by structuring learning. And when they're having to do it at home, that makes things all more difficult. And it can really result in conflict for parents as well, as they try to do that. They don't have the kind of same structures in place as a school to there's no bells at home to make sure people are on time. Thank you. That's really insightful. Thank you. The next one is about what we can do to help these girls. So you've been working in this field for most of your career. What interventions do you think would work particularly well with girls?
Well, the interventions that I tend to be asked to do, because I'm a doctor, usually have to do with pills and medicines. And I'm not sure that's the priority here. I think the priority here is going to be structuring life at home. I think it's going to be routines. And until you've got a routine in place, I think everything else is going to fall apart in terms of remote learning. So what I would urge parents to do, it ain't easy. I mean, may the force be with you, for goodness sake. It's going to be tough imposing routines upon ourselves. But I think a routine for the day, getting up at a particular time, engaging with the remote learning on time and not just recording it, having meal times, because schools provide breaks and relaxation breaks and so on. That needs to be built in and not negotiated on in turn every day, because that's going to lead to squabbles. So I think a routine is going to be really very important, certainly for the girls that I see. It may not suit everybody, and I don't want to sound like some sort of 17th century Puritan, but I think routines are good news for getting the stuff out of the way without having to argue everything all the time. I think that's going to be important. There's something which I think can be quite useful currently, which is that if there's a father in the family, having that person around can be quite helpful. If they're urged to talk aloud about what they're doing, how are they organizing their own work? If they can just talk and say, look, I've got to get these letters off. I think the most important are going to be, but on the other hand, the most urgent are going to be, and demonstrating by talking aloud the distinction between urgency and importance, which is basic element of time management. I think parents talking aloud and demonstrating by doing so how they think about getting stuff done could be very useful. That's not scientifically demonstrated. It just seems to me a common sense idea.
Brilliant, brilliant. So modelling what we're doing to our children
Absolutely.
and talking them through the process and saying, look, I'm really struggling too. This is hard, but this is what I'm doing to overcome this, can help build that empathy with them and their challenges, and also help them to see how they could do it for themselves.
I think so. I think it's sometimes just as simple as saying, I've got to go and get some bread and milk. There's going to be a queue, so I've got to allocate more time. So I've got to get there. This is not going to be easy, as it usually is, popping around the corner or popping to the local supermarket. I've actually got to think about this and plan about it, and just muttering about it, without making a big deal, just demonstrating how an adult thinks. Assuming, of course, that we have adults who do think systematically. It may actually train them up to, but I think talking aloud is a good idea. watch it though. I mean, it can get really, really irritating, but it's something to be brought into the picture from time to time, I suggest.
Yeah. Everything in moderation. Wonderful. So final question now, just an insight from yourself. Many parents and children are stuck at home and they're probably climbing the walls right now. What would you say to them to help them through this challenging time?
Well, I think, again, at the risk of repeating, well, I am repeating. I mean, I think routines, habits, a degree of organization does actually help the stress. Negotiating everything leads to arguments. Although I think it's a good idea for people to negotiate, I think they need to learn how to negotiate. What I like to say to families is to use the method that I learned when I was treating bank robbers in the American Midwest back in a very, very long time ago. It was actually the 1960s, which is a technique called SOCS, SOCS. And SOCS is S. What situation am I in? What have I got to do? I've got stuff I've got to do. I've got stuff I don't want to do. I've got stuff I have to do. But what's my situation? What are my options? Well, I can sit down and do it now, like a good girl, or I can wait till this evening, or I can chat to a friend and see how they're going about it. I've got a number of things that I could do, and that options is a plural. I've got to think of at least two ways in which I can deal with the situation I'm in. Then when I've got at least two ways, preferably half a dozen, what are the consequences? That's the C. So situation, options, consequences of each one. If I do it now, I get it out of the way, but it's really boring. If I leave it till this evening, that'll be great because I do better in the evening. But on the other hand, something might crop up. And then having done the situations, the options, the consequences, the S on the end is, so what am I going to do? So I think that little verbal rehearsal of SOCs, situations, options, consequences, and evaluating how to go about things is something you can't do all the time. It'd be terribly boring. But it does give you a framework. And it's a framework that parents can actually talk through with their daughter, or indeed for themselves. So I think a framework like that can be brought in as a way of dealing with a situation where we're relatively unstructured in terms of time and maybe unstructured in terms of priorities now the examinations have disappeared.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. Socks. I'm definitely going to remember that one. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Peter. It's been wonderful to speak to you, and I look forward to chatting again soon.